Hello, and welcome to the fifth and final installment of Females in Fire. So first, I wanted to take a few seconds to show you guys what the finished painting looks like. Just because for me, when I watch these sort of videos, it helps to see the finished painting first, because then I can sort of better understand why the artist makes certain choices as they paint. So here it is. And in this part, I won't be talking as much about the very specific things that I'm doing, but rather I'm going to try to talk more about my thought process and ways I have of approaching the painting that might help. Because I think learning to render is really an experience thing, and learning how to render different types of materials and settling on a rendering style that you like is something that just comes over time after you have some basic understanding of fundamentals. So for example, right now I'm rendering the fabric of her pants there, and there are a lot of things to think about when you render things like fabric, different materials, because not all fabric is the same, right? So I looked up some reference and tried to understand how thickness of fabric affects the way that it folds. So different types of fabric will fold differently. And I would say that leather is kind of falls into the same category. It folds the same way as fabric. It's just a little bit different because it's thicker and it's a little less pliable. So it's going to fold a lot differently than, say, a thin silk would. So I looked up reference, and my reference looked nothing like her pants or her sleeves in the actual painting, but I'm using it to try to understand the physics of how fabric folds. And again, the understanding is a lot more important because that allows you to you can use that knowledge in a lot of situations rather than just copying and getting an immediate satisfying result, but not really learning anything from it. I'm also going through and um, trying to correct perspective and basically just polish it up, trying to make sure that there are no places where the viewer would kind of look and go, oh, that place looks odd, because those are distractions to the visual communication of the piece. So if there's a spot that kind of draws the viewer's eye and they're like, what the heck, that looks weird, that is a distraction from the visual communication, and it makes the work look amateur and not very well thought out. I guess that's what I found. For hair, I think a common mistake that's made for hair is to try to draw the strands, and a lot of times in beginners' work, it kind of gives this spaghetti hair effect that looks very unnatural. For hair, you should really think about it as a single mass. So you should draw the overall shape, paint the overall shape, and then come in and then add the texture of the hair on top later. Now, at this point, the characters' pants and sleeves, they don't look like they're of a different local value than the armor. And what local value is the color of the actual object. So you can have a white pair of pants and a blue pair of pants, and they can be under the same lighting scenario, but obviously the white pair of pants is going to look much brighter. And that's what local value is. And so you can see the local value of the pants right now are very dark, and I intended it to be this kind of off-white cream color. But right now they're too dark, and they don't make the character feel very alive because the value structure is just all the same. It doesn't feel like there's good variance in the material. And I'm trying to dial back some of the saturation on the face. I think for faces, when I was learning how to draw faces, and still now, I tend to go to extremes. So skin tones are kind of tricky for me, and in the start they were too desaturated, and then I went to oversaturation because I started to learn about subsurface scattering and learn about the saturation of skin tones, and then I would end up saturating too much of the face. And the trick to making skin tones look lifelike, I think, is to know where the saturation should be and not try to saturate the whole thing. It seems to me like that tends to be a lot of the, or that tends to happen a lot, at least for me when I study and when I'm trying to learn, is that when I learn new concepts, I tend to overcompensate, and then as I get better at it, I begin to dial back to something that's better suited for the painting. So, for example, when I first learned about really reflective metals and stuff, I would push the contrast too much, or when I first learned about atmospheric perspective, I would push it too much, and it's just I think a lot of it is a matter of refining and trying to find the right medium. So I the video might not show it because it's quite compressed quite a bit, but I did flip back to my very first gesture several times, even in this final part, to make sure that I'm keeping the general feel of the pose. Because, like I said before, it's very easy to lose the gesture. Just a really subtle things can change it. And I'm going to the eye, and again, I'm looking at more reference. I'm trying to understand how the eye is fits on the face, and when I think about it that way, it helped me understand that the eye that I've drawn is actually out of perspective. I've drawn it as if it was looking straight at me, or on a face that was looking straight at me, but the face is turned. So there's some perspective issues, and these sort of mistakes, I think they come from just looking at things iconically, because it's easy to see things, but when you try to break it down, um, I think you oversimplify it, and you draw it as it would be iconically. I think that's why it can be so hard to learn art, is because sometimes you just draw and paint things the way you iconically think of them. And I don't think the average person goes through every day thinking about just the way that light hits forms and paying close attention to that. So those are sort of easy mistakes to make. Yeah, the whole process is just trying to learn how to break it down. At this point, I'm really thinking about how the viewer would view the piece more than anything. In the earlier parts, I thought about what would be a cool design, and then in this final rendering stage, I think about, since I already have the design, I try to think about where is the viewer going to look? What's the main focus? And this can be tough because after you stare at a painting for so long, you begin to lose an objective sense for how it looks visually. Because just because you've been staring at the same thing for so long, and sometimes you get tunnel vision, so it's good to get a lot of fresh looks on it. And I painted part five, I think, over the course of 3 days, and it was really helpful to get away from it and then come back, and it really helped me see some things that could be improved in the piece. So things like the ear, for example, is very subtle and very minimal, and that's because it's low light there. There shouldn't be a lot of contrast, and the viewer won't be looking there anyways. So there's no reason for you to need to spend a lot of time on that, or put high detail density there, because that's going to take away from the important parts of the piece. I knew that the background could be improved and refined a lot more, but I'm not too worried about that because this piece is the focus is so strong on the character, and there's so little contrast in the background, um, that it's not going to make a big deal, and I have full confidence that I can go back to the background and make it work with the character, without having too much trouble. So I'm not too concerned about that. For things like faces are kind of in their own league for in terms of learning how to paint them, I think, because they're what people are best at picking up on, just faces and facial expression. Just the subtleties of the face are so specific that the slightest thing can make it look odd, and even if one feature looks odd, it can make another feature look odd also. because of the proportions. And so it's sometimes faces are, I think, even tougher because when one thing is wrong, it may look like other parts are wrong also. So it can be hard to determine what exactly is wrong with it. And I'm trying to bring focus. I decided that I want the light to sort of beam down and hit her right side and part of her chest plate, but leave the left side of her body, which would be the right side of the screen, leave that in lower contrast. Yeah, I just try to think. This is just fundamentals stuff, basically just transferring the forms over to her right side on her arm there, and thinking about what they would look like at that sort of angle in that position. The bounce light is turned out pretty well. It let me put some nice warm lights on the bottom of all the surfaces. So I do a lot of transforming, and I use the liquify tool, and I also use a number of overlay and color layers to adjust the colors and saturations and whatnot. It's those are really good tools to learn and master because they can be really useful, and there's no reason to avoid using them if you think they can give you a better painting. I like to think that digital is it's very much its own medium, and it's different than traditional painting, and I don't think it should be thought of in the traditional painting sense. But in terms of understanding, all the understanding is the same as traditional painting. You just have more tools in digital to manipulate your images and to paint them in different ways. So things like the blue on her sleeves, that's I'm trying to unify the design language. So there's a little bit of blue on her armor, and I wanted to repeat that throughout the design. Um, Whenever you add a character, or I'm sorry, whenever you add a new element or a radically new color to a piece, you want to try to repeat that color in other places. And that's actually one of the reasons why I made her eyes red, because I didn't want to introduce a whole new color and make the piece feel not very well unified. So when I added that blue on the armor, I thought it'd be nice to add these blue stripes on the sleeves also to have some level of unity to make it look like this suit of armor was made to fit together. It just makes it feel a little bit more natural to look at. And this sort of concept goes for everything, even environments, characters, props. Uh, you usually if you add a whole new color and you don't repeat it throughout the design, you have to have a very specific reason. You should have a very good reason to do that, and it should be justified. The thing about making choices in painting and in design is that you have to remember that every choice should be conscious to some extent. By that I mean, so happy accidents happen, and maybe you see certain forms on the page that you didn't plan for at first, but then you go with it. But the choice to go with it should be very thought out. You should think of a good reason to go with it. It shouldn't be just, well, it's there, so I'll go with it. Because the thing is, in illustration, it's really competitive. The industry is very competitive, and if you're not making conscious choices, someone else is, and that just puts you a little bit behind them. So always good to make conscious choices and not add something just because you thought of it first thing. There should be some thought behind why you're adding something, what kind of significance it has in the image. You can see I lightened up the pants there, and at this point, I'm pretty happy with the image. I know that I'm probably not really going to hit any more hitches as I finish up this image after this hand. So I looked up some reference for the hand. I looked it up, but I didn't really refer to it as I was painting it. I just wanted to see sort of the nature of how an hand operates on sort of a mechanical level and where the joints are. And even though I'm not a pro at hands, or when you're painting anything, you don't have to be a pro at it. You just have to understand pretty basically what it looks like and the way it moves. And understanding the way something moves is really important to understanding the way it looks because in real life, form always follows function. And if you understand the function, then just through a thought process, or at least this is how I always go about it, is if I understand the function just through thought process, it helps me sort of derive how the form should look. And that goes for everything. That goes for fabric, hands, feet, nostrils, anything. Yeah, I talk about understanding, trying to understand what you're painting a lot because I feel like no amount of copying can compensate for that. There's because I feel like an illustrator's job is to represent reality, and if you don't understand reality, then your representation of it is going to be very limited. I'm not really sure what to say anymore. I think I've pretty much said everything, and I just feel like I'm rambling now, but I'm hoping that this is useful to someone. I think in the future, maybe I'll think about the format a little bit more, and maybe that'll help, but hopefully, this series has been useful to someone, or at least a little bit entertaining. So, working on the background now, and like I said, I'm not worried about the background at all. I don't feel like there's really much to it. There's really nothing I can do to mess it up because the background has so little contrast compared to the character anyways. So um, even any mess ups are not going to be very noticeable. And even though it is very far away and it's painted as though it were flat, I'm still trying to think of the forms in the back as 3D forms, 3D rock structures. I thought that dividing the dividing it down the side there, the two rock formations dividing it, I thought that would make it interesting and feel a little bit more grand. When I first started to try rendering rock, I thought that it had to be very detailed, and it took me quite a long time to realize that rock is probably one of the easiest things to render or to paint at least just because it's not like a face. I mean, it's pretty much the opposite or the reason why a face is so specific is also the same reason why rocks are so easy to render because rocks can be any shape. If you generally understand the way rocks break and erode on a very basic level, it's easy to understand how the eye would perceive that. So again, just what visual cues give it off that you're looking at a rock, and it's actually not very specific. You can see that my brushstrokes are pretty rough, and they still look like some sort of rock structures. I had a lot of fun doing the sword. I think part of why it was because I didn't have to stay so close to the design language of the armor. By that I mean that it's the sword is a weapon and the armor is, obviously armor. So there wasn't so much of a connection between the two that I guess I could say that I had a lot more freedom with the sword than I did designing other parts of the armor. Because after I had set the design language that I wanted for the armor, everything else had to be based on that. And when I add things like swords or weapons or trinkets or just sort of any accessories a character has, it's really good to try to think about why a character would have it also. So I tried to think about what type of character this is and what their temperament is, sort of what their persona is, and would they be the kind to use, a fast weapon, what sort of accessories would they have, and make sure that I don't end up adding really weird things. Like, I think if I were to give her something odd, if I were to give her guns or something, that would make her look really odd, because she doesn't look like the type of character that would be using guns. Just because we're so used to making sense of things, And when you see something that is odd, it's just too easy to pick up on it. Trying to add some debris. I find that debris really it can really make a scene come alive, make it feel like there's a little bit of movement. And I still felt like this was a little bit stiff, and you can see I painted out that little red brush stroke there. But I brought that back later and I turned into a red ribbon that was connected to her arm. And I thought that really did a lot for the piece. So as I was fixing the eye's perspective, like I said earlier, there was something wrong with the eye, but as I fixed the eye, it made the rest of the face, or I should say, just moving the eye down and changing the perspective, made her features look like were the features for a smaller face, but the size of the face was bigger. So I ended up cutting off part of the chin and resizing the head. Overall, I think I'm pretty happy with the face. I know it's not the best thing, but so here's the ribbon. And this is one, there's this thing that happens sometimes when you're painting where you know what you want and you go to paint it and it comes out just right. It just works. And those are some happy moments where, things just work out. Um, so I was really happy with that ribbon. I thought really added some movement to the piece. Here's the finished painting again. I hope this was helpful to someone, and thanks for watching.